Purify my heart. May every word, every thought, every motive, every intention be pleasing in your sight, oh God. For your voice refreshes my soul, brings joy to my heart and light to my eyes. Your words more precious than gold, sweeter than honey, better than life. Purify my heart. May every word and every thought, every motive and every intention be pleasing in your sight, oh God. For your voice refreshes my soul, brings joy to my heart and light to my eyes. Your words more precious than gold, sweeter than honey, better than life. Purify my heart. May every word and every thought, every motive, every intention be pleasing in your sight, oh God. Be pleasing in your sight, oh God.
My son, I have nothing I can give, but this chance that you may live, I pray we'll meet again. If He will deliver us, hear our prayer, deliver us from this hellish years of slavery, road to stand. Deliver us, there's a land you promised us. Deliver us out of bondage. Deliver us to the Hush now, my baby, be still, love, don't cry. Sleep as you're rocked by the stream. Sleep and remember my last lullaby, so I'll be with you when you dream.
waves of death swirled about me. The torrents of destruction overwhelmed me. The cords of the grave coiled around me. The snares of death confronted me.
I called out to God, Savior, draw near. From this temple my cry fell on his ears. He parted the heavens, he mounted the wind, and all of my foes were scattered by him. The Lord is my rock, the Lord is my fortress. He's my deliverer, he rescued me. The Lord is my rock, the Lord is my refuge, my shield and avenger. He's all I need.
I pursued my enemies and destroyed them, and I did not turn back until they were consumed. They cried for help, but there was no one to save them. To the Lord, but he did not answer.
And now they are crushed, dust in the street, pounded and trampled under my feet. Such loving kindness shown to his king, now and forever my soul will sing. The Lord is my rock, the Lord is my fortress. He's my deliverer, he rescued me. The Lord is my rock, the Lord is my refuge, my shield and avenger. He's all I need. The Lord is my rock, he is worthy of praise. The Lord is my rock, by his strength I am saved. The Lord rescued me from my enemies. The Lord is my rock and my victory. The Lord is my rock, the Lord is my fortress. He's my deliverer, he rescued me. The Lord is my rock, the Lord is my refuge, my shield and avenger. He's all I need. The Lord is my rock, the Lord is my fortress. He's my deliverer, he rescued me. The Lord is my rock, the Lord is my refuge, my shield and avenger. He's everything, everything. Purify my heart. May every word, every thought, every motive, every intention be pleasing in your sight, oh God. For your voice refreshes my soul, brings joy to my heart and light to my eyes. Your words more precious than gold, sweeter than honey, better than life. Purify my heart. May every word,
every thought, every motive, and every intention be pleasing in your sight, oh God. For your voice refreshes my soul, brings joy to my heart and light to my eyes. Your words more precious than gold, sweeter than honey, better than life. Purify my heart. May every word and every thought, every motive, every intention be pleasing in your sight, oh God. Be pleasing in your sight, oh God. ילדי הטוב והרע, אל תירא ואל תפחד. My son, I have nothing I can give but this chance that you may live. I pray we'll meet again if he will deliver us. Hear our prayer, deliver us from this very years of slavery, road to stand. Deliver us.
I have muted you all temporarily until we have some opportunity to have some interaction. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me okay? I see some thumbs up. Okay, that's good. Wonderful. Well, welcome.
Hi.
We've never done something like this before, so we're all going to be flexible, I hope, and trust that this will be a blessing to all of us as we think about Easter coming up and just the meaning of the Passover and what it helps us understand about what Christ has done. So we're going to begin here now. I think, is everything set up with Facebook? And
Yeah, I think, why don't we can some people post some likes if you can hear us on Facebook and it's working? There we go. Awesome.
Yes.
Thank you. All right, well, welcome everybody. We are super excited to share this with you because it's something that my family did as I was growing up. Every year, it was a huge impact in my life. And so if you have received in the comments or through Facebook, if you've received the little order of service, Dad, you have a copy, right? Let's just show them this. This is what it looks like in real life. It's a little booklet. And this booklet here that you guys have to follow along with us, it's called a Haggadah. And Haggadah is a Hebrew word, and it means to share, to tell. And so the Haggadah is the telling of the story of Israel's redemption from Egypt first, and then second of all, the telling of our redemption through Christ's death on the cross. And the Haggadah is a little booklet that you guys can follow along, and if you have not gotten that yet, I did post a link in the Facebook video. Those of you on Zoom, you're just going to have to deal with it, I guess. But if you actually, how did we get it to them originally? I think it was on Facebook, or on your email. So if you've not downloaded that yet, you can do that.
It's a link in the MailChimp as well.
Right. So, anyways, welcome. Thank you for being here. I'm going to turn it over to my dad, and my dad is going to be leading us in kind of explaining what you see here on our table, kind of like a history of the Seder, and yeah, so you ready?
Yeah, sure. I'll give a brief introduction, and then we're going to kind of launch in from there. And I have a couple points to make in the introduction. You can hopefully see some of the items that are here on the plate. We will offer that perhaps as a picture along the way, or that was the screen you were looking at when you first came on. This is a meal that stretches back thousands of years, right, to when God delivered the people of Israel from bondage. And so a couple of points to keep in mind as we think about this. First of all, when God set up a calendar for his people, he established 7 feasts, and this was the first. In fact, after Passover, God said, your calendar has been reborn. This is going to be the first month of your year from here on out. And so the year begins here at Passover for the religious Jewish person. And it was a reminder to them that they had been redeemed as a people. And so there are 7 feasts. And what is unique about those feasts is they look back to what God has done to save them as a people and redeem them. It also thinks about the present and the reality that God is here with us and that his presence helps us in our daily struggle and trial and saves us despite our daily sin. They also look forward, and we know that from our perspective, they look forward to Jesus and all that he did as the Passover lamb. We'll talk about that along the way. But they also look forward to a day when God is going to make everything right. We won't be locked in our homes anymore for this unique challenges that we're facing. And we're going to be able to experience with God this incredible relationship of blessing that has come to us because of Jesus. So that's that. And really what you see in front of you here is symbols of those realities. They're symbols of the suffering. There's bitter herbs here that remind them of the tears that were shed in their suffering. There's sweet things here on the plate that remind them of the sweetness of God's presence. We'll talk about that. There's a shank bone to remember about the sacrifice of the lamb. One of the interesting features on the plate now that wasn't the case at the time of Jesus is a burnt egg. And the reason that burnt egg is on the plate is because the egg is a symbol of life. And to the Jewish nation, the temple was the very place where they experienced life with God. And so it's a burnt egg. It's an egg that's been destroyed, and it's a reminder that their temple is destroyed. But again, as believers in Jesus, we have hope that extends beyond that. So that's kind of an introduction to this. One other point I want to make is partway through, we're going to be opening it up for questions for you to have in your own setting, for you to talk with the people who are there and think together about what questions you might have. The interesting thing about questions is you don't necessarily have to know the answer. Sometimes the questions themselves help to provoke learning and thinking. And so when we get into that question time, we're also going to invite you, for those of you on Zoom, if you have a couple questions that you want to raise for all of us and we'll think about together, or if you want to put it in the comments in the chat section, we can also look at it that way. During a time where we have a little break, we'll gather those questions and we'll try to address them. So I just wanted to highlight that for you as we begin. And at this point,
let me say one more word.
Yep.
Okay. I got my notes finally. I was like the whole time just trying to find my notes, so that's why that was a little awkward. But one thing that was kind of interesting about this might be the first year since Passover, possibly, when everybody celebrating Passover is stuck in their homes, like literally stuck. Because if you remember the Passover meal, when God was going to come and finish off the plagues that had been on Egypt, he was going to do so by taking the life of every firstborn male. So that would be me, right? So in that context, they were told, you go in your house, you put blood over the doorpost, and you stay inside, right? So this is probably the first time that the Jewish people and Christians around the world are celebrating Passover stuck in their homes. Maybe not the first, but one of the first, since that originally happened back then. So that was just kind of interesting. But my dad, we actually lived in Israel, and he has had a lot of experience leading this meal. So I'm going to be passing the torch to him quite often, and hopefully he'll be able to do a better job than I. But that brings us to the opening of the meal. And there's a very special honor, or privilege, it is an honor, given to the mom in the home. So my mom, she's actually not able to be here with us because she's feeling really sick and is stuck in her recliner. She's possibly going to have another surgery. Many of you know our family, so I think I can share that pretty openly. So we're praying about that right now, but she was in a lot of pain the past couple days, but she still wanted to be a part of it because she's always been a part of it. So,
and I would just add too that as you pray for her, actually her surgeon has asked her not to be up, so she's kind of breaking a little rule here to come and open our session together. But she's going to come and open the opening prayer for our Passover Seder meal,
right,
as was typical.
So if any of you actually have set up your table and you have the candles, this is the time at which you will light those candles. So this will be done if you have a mom in the home. It'll be done by the mom. And if there is no mom, then the dad would do it, or maybe one of the older daughters would do it.
And you don't have to follow this prayer. You could pray your own prayer. We'll give some space for you to pray on your own if you'd like.
Mm-hmm.
Just speak up loudly.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us through faith in Jesus our Messiah, the light of the world, and in his name we kindle the Passover lights.
Amen. Thank you, Mom. Mm-hmm. Can you guys be praying for her? She is in a lot of pain right now. That would be awesome. All right. Well, doesn't this look nice? We are now going to move into a drinking of a cup. Now, in this meal, there are 4 of these cups. And each of these cups is supposed to represent something specific. So they have different names. So there's the cup of sanctification, the cup of affliction, the cup of redemption, and the cup of praise, or the cup of his coming. And it's interesting, 2 of these cups were actually drank by Jesus during the Last Supper he celebrated. So we'll see about that in a second. So I'm going to pass it to my dad, and he's going to explain to you the first cup. And then if you're partaking with us, you guys can drink along with us at that point. But if you have some kids who are a part of this, make sure they don't drink all of their grape juice right in the first drink, because we have to get through 4, okay?
So maybe one of the questions you are asking is, why 4 cups? And what's interesting in the Passover meal is that 4 is a very significant number. So there are 4 cups. There are 4 questions, which you'll hear are actually not 4 questions. Well, you'll have to maybe think why that's the case here in a minute. But the 4 cups are representative of Exodus 6, where the Lord gave 4 I wills. And he said, I will bring you out from under the burden of the Egyptians. I will rescue you from their bondage. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm. And I will take you to myself as a people, and I will be your God. So we even hear a 5th I will there. And this is just a reminder of the fact that the Passover is about the main hero, and that's God. Sometimes we think of it as Moses, but it's God who is the hero, who is the one who is saving his people. So the first cup is the cup of sanctification. And let me give you a brief word of explanation. We're going to be doing these cups a little differently each time, but in a minute we'll be saying a prayer together. So if you have some juice in front of you, I'll say the prayer. We're going to say it once in Hebrew so you can hear the sound of it, and then we'll say it in English, and you can repeat that prayer in English, and then from here on out we'll say them all in English. But the cup of sanctification, just 2 practical thoughts here. When God delivered his people from Egypt, he set them apart. That's really what sanctification means. And there's 2 ways to think about how he set them apart. He set them apart from Egypt, so they were to separate themselves from the land of Egypt, the ways of Egypt, the sin of Egypt, and they were also to be separate to God. God was going to make of them a holy nation. And so there's 2 dimensions of what it means to be holy, separate from sin, separated to God for his purposes. And it's a great reminder of how the people, as they fled in haste, the bread that they took with them, baked in the packs that they had left Egypt with, and because they had removed all leaven, they had no way to continue their bread, and all of a sudden there they were in the wilderness, totally dependent on God for everything, not even able to can help themselves with bread. And many of us have had a small glimmer of that as we've gone to shelves over the past few weeks looking for bread. But that was the situation that Israel was facing. So here's the cup of sanctification. If you have your drink, I'll say it in Hebrew. In Hebrew, the prayer would be, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei pari hagafen. And what that means is, blessed are you, O Lord our God, creator of the universe and king of the fruit of the vine. You may take 1 drink.
I love this grape juice. So good. We don't have a bowl.
We'll skip it then. We'll just say, why don't you just say what this would be?
So at this point in the meal, we would usually have a bowl here if we were a Jewish family. They would wash their hands, and that was just kind of a continuing symbol of what my dad just was talking about being separate, right? So in the Bible, when we hear about sanctification, a lot of times that comes right along with the idea of being washed. Like you were washed by the blood of Christ, you were set apart and cleansed, that kind of concept. And in Jewish thinking, that was really big. And so they would wash their hands at this point to show their willingness to be purified by God. And at this point in the meal, Jesus, if you remember, in the night that he was betrayed and the night that he was celebrating the Last Supper, he actually got up from the table, and it says he removed his outer garment, and he took the bowl and poured water in it, and he went to wash the disciples' feet. Not to wash his own hands, but to wash their feet. And he gave that to us as this illustration of how we ought to serve one another. And if you remember Peter is like, absolutely not. You're going to wash my feet? I will not let you wash my feet. And do you remember what Jesus said to him at that point? He said, if I do not wash your feet, then you have no part with me. So in other words, we need to be cleansed by our king. We need to be cleansed by him. And so at this point in the meal, if you were celebrating this with your family, you might actually take a bowl and put water in it and wash all of your kids' feet. I think you did that one year. And so that was right in this point in the meal and went along with that tradition of washing hands. So now, if you look down at your plate, you will see one of the items on our plate is this these sprigs of parsley. And I just mentioned in the Passover story, they put blood on the mantle of the door with these hyssop branches. And so this is supposed to kind of look like a hyssop branch. It's supposed to be, you can't really see it against my shirt. Maybe if I put it in front of the white. There it goes. Yeah, so that, right there in front of the white, that's a little thing of parsley. And so what we're going to do is, this parsley is going to remind us of the bitterness of slavery that the Israelites were in. And so there's also these bowls of salt water that I asked you guys to make. So if all of you would take your parsley and then reach out and dip into the bowl of salt water, the saltiness reminds us that the slavery was a very bitter time and many tears were shed. And when you taste the salt, it's supposed to remind you of those tears that were shed in slavery. All right, this is really salty. Woo. Something else you see here in the middle of the table, there is a plate with what is called the afikomen. And so I'm going to let my dad explain to you the significance of this special. It's 3 pieces of matzah wrapped up in a cloth.
So I'm going to share a little of the significance, but I'm also going to just provoke some questions, and maybe we'll answer them here as we go along. But this afikomen, interestingly enough, is the only Greek word in the entire Jewish Seder meal. So one of the questions you might ask is, well, why are Hebrews rehearsing a Greek word? That's a great question. We'll think about. This afikomen pouch is also called a unity. And interestingly enough, if you were to look inside, there are 3 pouches. And in each pouch is 1 piece of matzah, 1 loaf. So this is a unity of 3, which is an interesting thing, right? We have a unity of 3. And this tradition, actually, if you look into it historically, seems to have begun around the time of Christ. So why is this tradition celebrated today by Jewish people? And in fact, as I had conversations with a rabbi here in Grand Rapids, I was talking to him about this as well. And it's interesting that this has become a part of their tradition. So at this point, what the whoever's leading the Passover will do is to reach in and grab the center loaf and to break it. And they'll take this loaf, this bread, and break it, and it will be put into this kind of cloth. And they'll have a napkin or we just have a piece of paper towel here. But this broken matzah is wrapped, and a little bit later in the meal will be buried. I'm going to hide this. And then it needs to be resurrected by one of the children. And then I will have to redeem it from that child by giving candy or something.
Light bulb should be going off right now.
So what is this unity of 3 of which the centerpiece is broken, buried, resurrected, and redeemed that we're talking about? And what does afikomen mean? That's coming up shortly.
Mm-hmm. Just be thinking about that. It's fascinating because in the Jewish mindset, do you want me? Would that give it away?
It's up to you.
Mike, I don't know what you're going for.
I
don't want to give it away.
Well, why don't you wait then?
Okay, we'll wait. Just let that question kind of marinate. Yeah. So these are all kind of traditional steps. Now, I love. This is one of the reasons I loved this as a kid. There's so much little symbolism and detail, and to think that this is celebrated all across the world by Jewish people was kind of a cool thought. And we're kind of, as Christians, we actually have an insight, right, into the meanings of it that the Jewish people don't even have, which is fascinating. But at this point in the meal, it's the tradition to have the story of Passover read. So I asked my brother.
Well, before that, there's the 4 questions, actually.
Oh.
If you want.
I was just following the order of this.
Oh, is that what it says?
Yeah.
Okay.
So what I would do is just pass this to my brother, and he's going to read Exodus chapter 12, verses 1 to 14. So just listen along. This is the story where all of this kind of originates, back in the earliest chapters of the Bible.
Nice and loud.
The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in Egypt, "This month is to be for you and the first month of the year, of your year. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share one with their nearest neighbor. Having taken into account the number of people there are, you are to determine the amount of lamb needed in accordance with what each person will eat. The animals you choose must be year-old males without defect, and you may take them from the sheep or the goats. Take care of them until the 14th day of the month, when all the members of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. Then they are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs. That same night they are to eat the meat roasted over the fire, along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. Do not eat the meat raw or boiled in water, but roast it over a fire, with the head, legs, and internal organs. Do not leave any of it till morning. If some is left till morning, you must burn it. This is how you are to eat it, with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. On that same night, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals. I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. This is the day you are to commemorate for the generations to come. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord, a lasting ordinance."
So if you caught that story, here we have Israel trapped in Egypt in slavery, and God has been going through all of these judgments and plagues, and it's gotten to the point where Pharaoh hasn't listened, and God is going to finally bring his most heavy and severe judgment, which is the death of the firstborn. And so this is about to take place, and God tells the Israelites to go into their homes to get a lamb that is supposed to be perfect. No blemishes, no broken bones, none of that. And that lamb is to be killed. They're to take some of the blood of the lamb and put it on the doorposts of the house. And then they're supposed to go inside the house and eat this meal, the Passover. And he says to eat it with their sandals on and their shirts tucked in and their staff. In other words, he's kind of pointing them to the fact that this is going to be over soon, and he's about to come deliver them. And they're supposed to be ready to get out of there. But it started very simple. It pretty much just started as the sacrificed lamb, and it was eaten around a table as a family. And that's a lot of this other stuff then has become additions that the Jewish people have added on throughout the years to help them remember. So at this point, usually one of the traditions is after the Passover story is read, and usually they will actually read the whole Passover story, which is like 4 or 5 chapters. At this point, the youngest in the family usually will have memorized these 4 questions in Hebrew. And it's interesting because they're actually 5 questions, but they're called the 4 questions. So we'll get to why they do that. But she's going to read these 5 questions, and then usually the dad of the family will answer. Okay, so Catriel is going to be doing this for us.
Let me say one word of introduction before Catriel reads the questions. This is really cool for me, by the way, to be sitting here and realize that my kids, who we grew up kind of doing this as a family, now are the ones taking it over and doing it. And one of the neat things about of this celebration was it's a way to pass on these kind of really critical, seminal ideas about who God is to our kids. And so this is a great way to do this every Easter with your family, and I just encourage you to do that. The reason the questions are here is to say, okay, we want the young people to be raising questions all through the meal. We want to talk and think together and think about what we know about God and what God has revealed to us and learn together. And so part of the Passover is that mutual intergenerational learning that can happen at a table. So it's cool to watch my children here kind of leading the way in that. And Catriel is going to ask these 5 questions that are called the 4 questions. And I'll give some answers, and then I'll have one thing at the end.
Why is this night different from all other nights?
Well, once we were slaves in Egypt, but now we're free. The Lord delivered us with a mighty hand and redeemed us that night. And so every year we set apart this night to remember what God has done.
On all other nights, we eat either leavened or unleavened bread. Why, on this night, do we eat only matzah, which is unleavened bread?
Well, God commanded that we remove all leaven from our house. And on the night of the Passover, our families were forced to flee in haste. And so the dough in their packs baked in the hot sun of Egypt, and as they fled in haste. And so we eat unleavened bread.
On all other nights, we eat whatever vegetables we want. But why, on this night, do we eat only a bitter one?
We eat a bitter herb on this night because we remember the bitterness of what it meant to be slaves in Egypt before the Lord delivered us.
On all other nights, we do not dip our vegetables even once. But why, on this night, do we dip twice?
We dip twice because we're remembering 2 things. As Josiah mentioned, we are remembering the tears that were shed, but we're also remembering the miraculous deliverance through the Red Sea, the salty sea.
On all other nights, we eat either sitting up or reclining. But why, on this night, do we all recline?
We recline because we remember that we are free people. And the reason our family's laughing, our family normally eats reclined because of their medical conditions. So Catriel is sitting
Why
up.
on this night of all other nights do we eat sitting up? What is this?
It's a little opposite of what we're normal for us. So sorry that we're laughing. Kind of an inside joke. One comment here, though, it's interesting that the Jewish people, they want to keep that symbolism of the 4, but they give 5 questions because they want to again encourage young people to raise questions. So there's a question more than the 4, just to show it's okay. It's okay for you to ask your question. There's no bad questions. And so what we'd like to do is take 5 minutes.
Yeah,
Let's take 5 minutes, and around the groups that you're at, just raise some questions. If someone has an answer, feel free to share it. If you have a thought, feel free to share it. If you have a question you want to write into the chat area, and maybe we'll ask somebody at least to share a question that came from your group. So take 5 minutes and ask your questions. And we can do it quietly here.
Yeah, we can talk quietly.
So,
I'm going to talk about
what means? It's just one of the
That is a good question.
That's a good question. It's one of the bitter herbs that are in there. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Sometimes people, if they don't have the what's it called? This stuff.
Oh,
Horseradish. They'll eat the onion. So be thankful that we have horseradish.
Oh, wow. Should we do the second dipping? Seeing as we all have person left. And they do too.
If you want to, you can do about the Red Sea, the joke if you want.
Okay. Would that be it? Oh, that's what we're supposed to do now. What we're going to do, right? I think so.
Why don't you do it right after we do the question?
Okay.
We can tell them we're doing a shortened version. That's why we haven't put it into the thing. Any other questions?
Mama. When you were in Israel, did you get to see families during the Passover?
Yes, in fact, we were invited to Passover with our congregation of Jewish families.
That was the time where all of the Jewish people had to literally slaughter a lamb.
That
Or
was
that
actually the Samaritans that we watched. Slaughter a lamb.
Okay.
You should mention that story.
I am. I'm going to share that right here.
That sounds terrifying.
I've seen that in Indonesia.
An actual sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
When
There's
is?
something.
Yeah, that's cool.
When are you going to share that?
Under the affliction one, when I do the 10 drops.
Oh, okay. That's coming up here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So we'll do that right after these 4 questions.
Yep. Any other questions?
Are kids like encouraged to ask any question at any time, or do
Oh,
they
yeah.
have to follow a specific?
No. In fact, it's meant to be very informal, and maybe we should bring that up. That's a good reminder that this is something that you do as a family, and you can add your own traditions and your own things that are meaningful. And, yeah, that'd be cool to include.
Do you want to bring them back?
You ready? You think? Do you want to see if there's any questions?
All right. So we wanted to get some of your questions and just kind of see what's been going around the table. So if you type them into your chat window, whether you're on Facebook or Zoom,
Or you can unmute yourself in Zoom.
yeah, if you type it into your chat box, or if you unmute yourself, you could just speak it out, and then everybody can hear you.
So, question.
Sure. Let's repeat it.
Okay. With looking at the stuff online and everything, as I have my computer right in front of me, what is applesauce the symbolism of?
That's a great question. And if I could ask for you to be patient on that, it's actually something we're going to talk about a little bit later. So it's a great question. It's kind of heading just to where we're going. But it'd be great if we could wait till we're right at that point.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a great
The
question.
chauffeur.
The question for those who may not hear, I don't know if
Yeah.
they heard, but the question was, what does the apple mixture or applesauce represent? And we're going to be talking about this special mixture that actually Josiah made for our family.
Y'all saw that video.
Any other question, either on Facebook or on...
Plus, with on top of that too, is that what are the onions as themselves supposed to symbolize too? Because it's like I see onions,
Yep.
but with all these sorts of fruits, it's like I'm trying to get understanding for besides from the parsley, what each and every food has its resemblance for.
So the question again was, what about the onions?
Yes.
We actually, if you guys are seeing the plate here, we actually have 2 bitter herbs. So we mentioned the bitter herbs, but that would also be something that's going to be explained shortly. So
And I think we're giving kind of a shortened version. One of the questions that came up while we were talking quietly while you were talking was, and I don't remember how we got there, but it was, could questions be raised at any point during the meal? And the answer is yes. And this is really meant to be personalized. So as a family, you might recount specific ways that you've experienced God's unique deliverance and His presence and His comfort and His care. And you might add that to your celebration. So what you'll find is that the Jewish people often will celebrate certain things alike, but many things they're going to celebrate that are quite different from one another. So those second bitter herbs are often a part of it too, and we're not going to be eating those here tonight. But
yeah, thank goodness.
Well, very good. I appreciate those questions.
Yeah, we had a question over here on the chat box from Facebook, which was why the 2 candles, and I don't know the answer.
You know, I think this is just our tradition. I think in many Jewish traditions there might just be a single candle that is lit, and I'm trying to remember right now why we.
You have the painting of Mount Sinai with the 2 candles.
That's true. I have a painting in my office, and it was drawn by a Jewish man. The name of the painting is called Light to the Nations, and its setting is the Sinai Desert, and there's what looks to be Mount Sinai, which is represented by these two huge candles, both of which are lit. And those candles are supposed to represent the two tablets of God's, the two parts of God's law, right? The law that helps us understand what does it mean to love my Lord my God with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength, and how do I love my neighbor as myself. And then all around those giant candles are tiny little candles, like a million of the nation of Israel surrounding, and they're all candles that also have flames. And so the idea was they were to reflect the character of God in their own life by how they lived and how ethically they lived their lives. And that was to be a light to the nations around them. So it could be, maybe Josiah's right, maybe originally we had that painting hanging behind us, and it was a good reminder of the character of God revealed in those two tablets, the Ten Commandments.
It's my best guess. Do we have any more, Jareth, that you can see? Is Seder the same as Passover? That's a good question. Is Seder the same thing as Passover?
Actually, no. The Hebrew word for Passover is Pesach. Seder is actually the word for the plate. And what Seder means is, like, if you come up to someone and say how you're doing in Hebrew, the answer to that is Hakol Baseder. And it means everything is in order. And so Seder is a word that means order. And so what the plate does is it kind of creates an order of a way to think about what God has done in redeeming his people. So the Seder is the order or the organization of the service. That's a great question.
We're going to do one more from Zoom because Katri saw it over on this other computer. By the way, if you're on Facebook, we're talking to people. That's because there's a second feed for my dad's Sunday school class and some people from our church, and they're over on the other computer. So that's why we're talking to people that way that you can't see.
We're not crazy.
We're not. Well.
Okay.
You want to read it, Katri?
Sure. So the question is there significance in the specific order?
Well, that's a great question. And I would say that in terms of when we get to the time of Jesus, remember Jesus was celebrating the Passover meal. And like Josiah had said, that had been added to by the traditions of Jewish families for all of those years until the time that Jesus came. And so they were eating a meal. We read that they were reclined. Okay, that was not a part of the original Passover, but it was a reminder to them that they were free, right? And that was a tradition that had been added. So a lot of the order of that tradition developed over time. So the 4 cups, it's interesting. The cup we drank a minute ago, the cup of sanctification, we read in Luke 22 that Jesus took the cup before dinner and he drank it with his disciples and he said, I'm not going to drink this again until I enter my kingdom with you, which is interesting for us, right? We have that anticipation one day of actually celebrating Passover with Jesus.
This meal, right.
Yeah, which will be really cool. Then we read later that Jesus takes a cup after the dinner, and it's a cup that's coming, and it's the cup that he says is the new covenant in my blood. And it's not the cup of sanctification, it's actually a different cup. And you may remember the one Josiah said, but if you haven't, well, let's just hold it in tension for a minute. So there is a little bit of an order of moving, through the story from leaving Egypt, dependence upon God, and yet I think some of this order actually was a result of the tradition that emerged over the years. Great question.
Cool. Those were all really good questions. So at this point, we are going to do our second cup. So my brother is going to lead us, Jesse, in the praying of that prayer again, and we can all drink a second swig of grape juice.
And you can pray that prayer as well after Jesse prays it, if you're kind of leading your group.
Yes, you can pray it after Jesse if you would like to.
Should I do it in Hebrew?
Do you know it?
Mm-hmm.
Ooh.
Wow.
I didn't know he
think
knew
so.
it in Hebrew. Yeah.
Just from like right now.
Okay.
I can't remember it. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu, melech haolam, borei peri hagafen, which means, Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, and creator of the fruit of the vine.
Well, for all you mothers out there, I apologize in advance, because at this point, that cup is the cup of affliction, and it's a reminder of the fact that the nation of Israel was delivered under great affliction, and that the nation of Egypt experienced these plagues when God brought judgment on the gods of Egypt. And that's an interesting, if you ever want to study, how that the very things that were part of those plagues were directed to these beings that the Egyptians were worshiping, demonstrating that they had no power.
Like the sun and the god of the earth and the harvest. And
The frogs, the gnats, all of these things were a part of their worship rituals. And God was bringing judgment, not just against the land, but against their religious system. So here's what I'm apologizing for. At this point in the meal, what you do is you take your glass, and you're going to stick your finger in, and I'm going to say one of the plagues, and then and this is meant if you have grape juice, and I realize some of you may not have grape juice because you couldn't get to the store, but you put a drop of it on your plate for every plague, and so the grape juice actually looks a little bit like drops of blood, and plus you've stuck your finger in your drink, which is what moms typically aren't too happy with. But that's what we're going to do, and if you're okay with it, I'm going to say a plague, and you then repeat the plague, put your finger in, and put one drop on your plate. All right? Does that make sense? So I'll show you. The first plague, blood.
Blood.
Yeah, you all say blood. Okay. Frogs.
frogs,
Lice.
lice,
Disease on livestock.
disease on livestock,
Boils.
boils,
Hail.
hail,
Locusts.
locusts,
Darkness.
darkness,
Death of the firstborn male.
death of the firstborn male.
Now, I just want to share one story with you, and then we're going to actually move to the question that was raised here about the applesauce and the apple mixture. When we lived in Israel, we had the opportunity, we were invited to go watch a Passover. Now, one of the sad things for the nation of Israel, and it's just to me a realization, they don't have a temple, they can't sacrifice. And so you see just the struggle within the Jewish culture to how do we deal with sin. God was very specific about what had to be happening to cover sin. We know as we read through the New Testament, especially the book of Hebrews, that Jesus himself was both the great high priest and the sacrifice that sacrificed his own blood as the Lamb of God to take away the sin of the world. And that's the hope, right? That the only one who could truly cleanse us from our sin was God himself, was Jesus, God made flesh and living among us. And so while we were in Israel, we got to go to a Passover that is held by the Samaritans. You may remember the Samaritans are this group that were really looked down upon at the time of Jesus. They still live in the land to this very day. And so the Samaritans have they sacrifice, you remember with Jesus talking to the woman at the well? She said, we sacrifice on this mountain, you sacrifice in Jerusalem. They still sacrifice at that mountain. So I went with these two guys when they were real little. Rinda was with me, and we got there and we watched them. And at twilight, every family had their lambs. And the high priest would pray, and every family killed the lamb as a way to cover the blood. And I'll never forget, after that sacrifice took place, I was watching, and we were down among them, and there was this grandfather holding his little granddaughter, and tears were just streaming down her face. And as we had come into the Samaritan village, we had seen all the families who had set aside a lamb and had tied it up they had cared for it, right? And it almost becomes like a pet to the family. And here this little girl had watched this lamb that she had cared for those days sacrifice. And she was speaking a language I couldn't understand, but she's pointing to her lamb, and her grandfather is trying to explain. And I thought, what would I say if I were alive during the time of the ancient Israelites and my daughter or my granddaughter said, why do we have to kill the lamb? Why do we have to sacrifice the lamb? What would I say to them? And the only thought that came to me was, sin is expensive. There's a cost. And that's why Jesus had to come and die. If sin didn't have that kind of consequence, God would never have had to send his son to pay for our sin. And so that cup, the cup of affliction, is a reminder of that reality, that apart from Christ, we would be dead in our sin. But because of Jesus, that affliction has been lifted. He's borne our affliction. He's carried our sorrows.
Right. So the plagues in Egypt, which were God's affliction or judgment against their sin, those are similar in nature to the ones that he's going to bring on the world in his second coming, before he comes again. They're not exactly the same, but they're very similar. And it's true, like, that sin has a cost, and that the only reason we're not going to face that judgment and God's kind of removing his hand of blessing from us and letting the earth just fall apart in front of our eyes is that we're sheltered in the blood of Christ, and that protects us. So do we do the...
I have a question.
We have a question? Yeah.
Yes.
Make sure you repeat it.
Interrupt. It's still like related in some sort of way to this, but does God still today perform visions and dreams like unto generations that we're living unto? I know this has nothing to pertain unto
So
what we're doing.
the question, does God still use dreams or visions?
Yes.
So there's debate among Christians about that very question, and maybe we can even talk about that afterward. One of the things we recognize is that God has given us a complete revelation in his word, and we have what we need in that book, really, to understand his purposes for us. Now, it's not to say that we want to put God in a box and say God can't do this and God can't do that. God is at work. He's alive. He's doing some amazing things. And I've met with some Muslim believers who have come to faith because they have had this unique encounter with Jesus, and whether it's a dream or a vision or the Spirit of God at work in their heart, they have come to faith in Christ. And yet we know that we have a complete revelation from God. All that we need is right there for us. And it's one good reason for us to be people who know the book well and are in the book on a regular basis. So that would be my quick answer to that.
That's a good answer.
To that question.
Are we going to do the redemption before the... Yeah.
Why don't you do to do this about...
All right. So to your first question, Daniel, we are finally to the bitter herbs and the applesauce, or haroset.
That's in Hebrew.
Which is the Hebrew. So this is a representation of two kind of parallel things that we can see about God through the story of him delivering them from Egypt. The first of it is the suffering that they went through. Mm-hmm. And the fact of the matter is, some people will tell you, if you believe in God, God just wants to take all your suffering away. And that is just absolutely not true. God wants to love us and protect us, but there is no place in the Bible where he promises to take our suffering away. He actually says the opposite. He said, if you're going to follow me, we're going to share in his sufferings. We're going to share in the sufferings Jesus went through. And if you think about Jesus' life, how much suffering he had. Now it's a little bit different, because with the Israelites, their suffering was kind of a punishment for their disobedience. So there's a little bit of a difference there. But the first side of this is bitter. And whether you use onions or horseradish, we start by eating that side of the matzah. But then, after eating that, then you eat the side with the applesauce, or this thing called haroset. Now, you guys probably cannot see that very well in the camera, but it's supposed to look like bricks. And if you made it, like with the recipe I shared, it kind of looks like bricks. And that is kind of to represent the bricks that the Hebrews used to build the pyramids when they were slaves. But it's sweet. And it's kind of a beautiful picture, I think, of the fact that suffering can turn sweet. God can actually use suffering to produce in us character He can grow us. He can make us hope in Him. So what we're going to do is we're going to eat this. If you have this on your plate, we're going to start with the bitter. We have horseradish here, which can kind of make you get teary. And then we're going to move to the haricot at the other side, okay?
All right, begin.
Yeah, you put a lot of horseradish.
I was just noticing that. Get ready, everybody. Buckle down.
Oh, if it's done right, you should be crying.
How does it feel to suffer?
Mm.
And then the sweet.
I think David's struggling.
Somebody else is crying with us.
All right. So now we're kind of doing, like my dad said a while ago, it is a condensed kind of version of the Passover. And normally there'd actually be a meal that took place right about here in the middle, or kind of a little bit past the middle of the Seder. But we're not going to do that just because of time. However, I did kind of encourage people to save their desserts. So we have a comment. Somebody was saying they're crying just watching. We appreciate the empathy. It's empathy, right? When you can kind of relate to somebody's pain.
Yeah.
Yes, I appreciate it. Thankfully, that's not like the hardcore horseradish.
Yeah,
Because there's some horseradish that will like
We wouldn't be talking for a while.
boom. Yeah. So at this point, we would normally have a meal. What we're going to do is we're going to break again for about 10 minutes. And this is going to be a time I kind of wanted to pose a question that you guys can talk about with your families. And here's the question. The question is, how has God been faithful to us through trials? So another way to say that would be, how have you experienced God's presence in the midst of suffering? How has your family experienced God delivering you in the midst of your trials? And so we're going to kind of pause to talk about that for 10 minutes. At this time, if we were having a meal, and you guys can do this if you've taken the piece of matzah and wrapped
Especially
it.
if you have kids.
Yeah, and if you have kids and you have this piece of matzah, the dad will go and hide this in the house. So at this time, while we're talking about that question, dads, you can kind of like skedaddle quick and hide this somewhere in your house, okay? It's the broken piece of matzah that's been wrapped. Just make sure your kids don't see it, and if they're older, you're gonna have to hide it harder. But yeah, the question was, how has God been faithful to us in the midst of our trials? So why don't we just all kind of talk about that? I will put on some music for you guys. And then after this discussion, we can have our dessert, if you've saved your dessert.
Come and see what God has done. is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup runs over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
I think we're back.
So, I don't know how many of you were witnessing
To
our
witness this, we've added a tradition.
a new tradition. Well, it's probably not new, actually. It's probably quite an old tradition of the father spilling his grape juice on his son, which you may have watched. It's kind of a salvation through baptism, kind of a metaphor, I think,
Yeah,
maybe.
washed in the blood.
It
Yeah.
made Josiah a lot more holy than he was before.
So, that was not scripted, but it did happen nonetheless.
Yes. So, now we drink the third cup.
No. I do want to say...
Yeah, we have a couple of things we wanted to mention quick before we get to the third cup. First one was from my dad.
Okay. Thanks.
Thanks, Mom. You should be laying down.
I know.
So, just a couple of quick comments. We're gonna be eating this piece of matzah with the apple mixture on it here as a reminder again of kind of what Josiah was talking about, the presence of God, how the presence of God is sweet in our life, and I hope you had a meaningful conversation about, in the midst of your own trials, in the midst of your own suffering, the challenges you're facing, how the presence of God is sweet in the middle of that. But I was just reminded, we as a family have grown so that our daughter, who's actually on the call on the second feed here, and her husband are in Virginia, and they're participating with us in this. And it was a great reminder to me of how Deborah and Levi now are passing on this tradition of Oops, our internet connection is unstable. Can you guys still hear us? I see people say they can. Okay, good.
Yep.
Just a reminder of how, as we build into the lives of our kids, and this is one holiday to do that, it's just a wonderful reminder to me of Deborah and Levi and how, as a new family, exciting for me as a grandfather, with Deborah and Levi expecting, just what a blessing to realize how God can pass these faith traditions, these things that, give us strength, understanding and seeing God's presence in our life as we see the next generation carry that torch. And so what a blessing that is to be able to participate in that. So just a quick story. The story is told, and maybe you've heard this, or forgive me if you have, but of a competition that was given for a group of artists to all paint their perspective on the word peace. And so all these different artists, they painted these pictures to represent the concept of peace. And there were beautiful fields and sunsets and mountains and rivers and, again, wonderful things that each of these artists had depicted to represent peace. Interestingly enough, in the story, the painting that won in this competition was a raging waterfall. And as you think about a raging waterfall, perhaps you say, what in the world does that have to do with peace? But in the painting, in addition to the raging waterfall, there was a beautiful branch that was sticking out of the waterfall, jutting out of the waterfall, and at the end of the branch was this nest. And in the nest was a mother bird with her sleeping baby birds. In the midst of all of this chaos, they were safe asleep with their mother in a raging waterfall. And again, a beautiful, I think, picture. And if the story is true or not, I don't know, but it's a beautiful picture of the peace that we experience in Christ, right? Of the reality of his presence, even in the midst of suffering.
Right.
And
so peace isn't the absence of trials, it's being with God in the middle of a trial.
That's right. So if you have this, feel free to eat your apple mixture.
So we wanted to hear from you, possibly some of the ways that God has been faithful to you. At this point, if you haven't started your dessert yet, you could be eating it, just so you know. But why don't we, as we eat dessert together, why don't we just talk for 5 minutes, 5 or 6 minutes on just like, how has God been faithful to you?
You can post it?
You can post it in the comments, or you can unmute yourself and just briefly share. Hey, it looks like somebody just shared. I can't see that. If you can scroll up a little bit, just with 2 fingers, don't click. Slide it over, yep. Yeah. So can you read this, Jareth? This is from the Ramsey family.
God blessed me when I was younger, got into a lot of trouble, 3-time felon, should have been a foster parent after being denied by Lansing. I got down on my knees and wrote a heartfelt letter. Here we are 15 kids later, praise his holy name.
Wow.
I don't know if you all could hear that. Could the people on this feed hear that? Yes, good. So read loud, Jer.
You can keep going.
Read that second one.
It's the same one.
Oh, it's the same one?
That's an awesome testimony, Keith. I didn't even know that God specifically did that. That's really cool. It's a blessing to just see in my own life too how God has changed me from this super, super like cocky, selfish high schooler who was all out for his own just fun and has changed my heart. And like that's what Jesus does when we come into relationship with him, is he changes us. That's awesome. Do we have any other people?
Yeah.
I hear somebody. I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Daniel.
Hey, the way that God has definitely been working in my life is because back with all the circumstances that I've gone through, as you guys saw me from leaving from the church and everything, but from the path that He's taking me onto and everywhere that He's guiding me is like it's helped me to realize a lot of things, just definitely in life, and just make me stronger, and especially that with multiple people just guiding me where, hey, I'm going to take this path or go and take this path. I actually had someone who, as another counselor, told me, hey, try for this college specifically. I've applied for this one specific college online, got enrolled in it, and now it's just been a blessing that I have you, Josiah, working right next to me and doing this type of stuff, because as you've seen, for the heart I've had for continuing for ministry and whatnot, and trying to establish as to where God's had just put me. But on top of that too is that way that God is more working in my life is since I was actually working with the job for WeConnect and for Dish, as many of you guys can see it for what I'm wearing, and got laid off. That has been very much a difficult time, because I'm not only one in for this boat, but many other people. So I've been continuously just searching, but God's been just providing me with a place to lay my head down. Upon that too is that there's been so many people who've been supportive, but I appreciate so much.
So let me try to sum up what Daniel's saying. You guys know Daniel Grote, I think most of you. He came to our church for a while, but he's been through a really rocky time in his life recently with losing some jobs and just then like being stuck and not knowing what to do. And he was just talking about how God has been faithful to continually provide a place for him to lay his head down at night, continually leading him just through his relationships with people, conversations he's been having. This one conversation recently where a guy pointed him to a Christian college where he's going now, and he said that has just been a huge blessing in his life, and like was just thankful that God is continuing to lead him, even though he for a while didn't have a job and didn't really know what to do next in his life. Is that a good summary?
That's a good summary, especially with you being as for a mentor beside me. But thank you definitely for summing up. It's like
yeah, you're welcome, Daniel. Why don't we do one more? Maybe somebody on the Zoom feed who hasn't said anything yet. Somebody who hasn't spoken. Thank you to the Cornishes for this coffee dessert. I'm a big fan of coffee. It's good.
Oh, there goes the likes.
Is there a question that got typed there, Koch? Or a statement?
There's a statement that says we get to babysit the school chinchilla during this hard time.
Somebody's babysitting a school chinchilla. That has to be a mix
The
of
best.
trials and probably pretty sweet too.
Yeah, pretty cute.
Pretty cute. Do we have any other people who have one more testimony of something God has done, brought you through? I'm kind of keeping my eye open.
Something else
There's
got
one.
posted.
Okay, here's one.
Stall cup.
So the stall cups say, God has provided a car and a home, and each new thing we've needed in perfect timing.
Stall cups.
That's
stall-
Deborah and Levi.
That's my sister, yeah.
That's really cool.
Well, I'm sure God has been faithful to all of us, right? Just the fact that we have families who believe in Him and are sitting here talking about Him around a virtual table is evidence of the fact that God is just so faithful. So at this point in the meal, we're going to move on to our third cup. And where's my Bible? Oh, you spilled grape juice on it. That's right.
I did.
Did we?
On the word of the Lord.
You spilled blood on the word of the Lord. So,
Do you want to
So-
read it, or do you want to just talk about it?
I mean, I think I have a shortened version on my notes, so I'll just read from my notes. Okay. So yeah, if the dads have not yet taken grape juice and spilled it on the eldest, that does need to happen at this time. Okay, so Dad had mentioned how Jesus, before the meal, had taken one of the cups, the cup that was done before the meal, and has said, "This cup I'm not going to drink again until I meet you in your kingdom." Or you meet me in my kingdom. I'm sorry, I misquoted that. So that cup before the meal was a symbol of being sanctified to God, and that is the cup that we're going to drink one day when Jesus comes back, and we have that. I think the marriage supper is that supper. The marriage supper of the Lamb is a Passover meal, and we're going to drink that cup with him. But then it says in Luke chapter 22, verse 20, after supper, Jesus took another cup of wine and said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for you." So this is the cup after supper. After supper, he took this cup and said, "This is the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for you." For Christ, our Passover lamb, also has been sacrificed, we read in 1 Corinthians. Jesus is the ultimate Passover lamb to be the final sacrifice, to put aside the sacrificial system that the Jews did, to say, my blood was sufficient for the sins of everyone, past, present, and future, who will believe. And that's what Jesus accomplished there. And it's interesting, I think sometimes we lose, as we celebrate communion, the modern way, we lose the connection to this rich history and tradition. That this third cup, if you guys remember it, does anybody think they can guess it? I'm curious if anybody...
You said it at the beginning.
I said it at the beginning, what the name of this cup is. And it's interesting that Jesus chose this cup, specifically the cup after supper, to institute the Lord's Supper. It is not the cup of the Lamb. Good guess. The name of it is the cup of redemption. And for Israel, when they drank this cup, they were celebrating how God had bought them out of slavery. But Jesus took that cup and he said, this cup is now supposed to symbolize my blood, which was shed for you on the cross. And so we're going to drink this third cup, and I'm going to read again the prayer that we have been reading this entire time. The prayer is, "Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe and creator of the fruit of the vine." And as we drink, we do this in remembrance of Christ. I'm going to do that now. It also says then that after supper he took a piece of matzah and he broke it. And my dad alluded to this earlier, that this piece of matzah that was broken, right? It came out of this unity of three. These three pieces of matzah in one pouch. And it's fascinating, I think, that the Jews celebrate this and they really don't know why. It's a tradition, and you can ask rabbis and they kind of will differ in their opinions about why do we take these three pieces, put them in one thing? Why do we take the middle one out and break it and then go hide it and then resurrect it, buy it back? What is all this about?
And what does afikomen mean?
Yeah, and then...
Do you remember?
What does afikomen mean?
The Greek word?
I don't.
Oh.
Okay, so my dad will... So, if any of you hid this in the house, why don't we see if the kids can now go and find it? Because the parents buried it.
I think they were supposed to do that.
They were supposed to do this while they were doing dessert. So if you haven't yet done it, I know Katri hasn't.
What?
You haven't looked for it yet.
No.
So normally, I did the order wrong. Normally we would do this before we drank the cup and ate the bread. But since I got the order wrong, why don't we do that right now?
Dad, how many rooms does this encompass?
It's right here.
It's right in this room.
Oh, in this room?
Think Italian.
Well,
Think
that's
Italian.
nice.
So anybody want to venture a guess as to why the Jewish people do this special ceremony where they break the bread and they hide it and they buy it back? Anybody have any thoughts or guesses on this? I think you know some theories.
Resurrection.
Well, the word afikomen, I'll just say this. This is an interesting fact. afikomen is the only Greek word in the entire Seder, and it's actually an interesting form of the Greek word that means I have come. And there's a continuing effect of that coming. And so each Passover, the Jewish families are, in essence, celebrating the fact
That Jesus has come.
that Jesus has come. And
They just don't realize they're celebrating that.
I often wonder when we read in the Bible that one day God will remove the blinders from the eyes of his people, and they will recognize him whom they've pierced. If this Passover meal is actually going to be part of those blinders being raised in the lives of families who have been celebrating all of these years the fact that their God has come in his first visit to this earth, and he will come again. So it's a tremendous reminder of that reality. And Katri found it.
And Katri found it. So at this time, what would happen is if the child found it, the father would purchase it back. He'd ask for it back, and the child would say, "No, I can't give this to you. You have to buy it." So Katri would.
I'd have to buy it back, and I didn't bring my candy.
You
Yes.
could give her Josiah's glasses.
Yeah, that's mine.
You could give her your glasses.
But I will give you chili chocolate.
Yeah. So Dad says he's going to give her chocolate for it. Is that a good enough price?
Let me think for a minute.
Go for more.
Go for more.
Is that a deal?
I suppose.
And so I have to redeem it back.
So isn't that an awesome symbol? That just kind of crazy that the Jews as a whole people still celebrate this and they do this, not realizing that Jesus has come and that whole breaking of the bread started. I mean, they trace it back to
About 2,000 years
about
ago.
2,000 years ago, which is the time of Christ, when that tradition started. So it's pretty amazing. So anyway, Jesus took the bread and he did break it, and he said that this was a representation of his body, which was broken for us. We read in Isaiah, his stripes were what healed us. By his stripes we're healed. By his wounds we are set free. So we're going to take and we're going to eat this in remembrance of Christ. And we go straight into searching for light. All right. So at this time, we have this extra place set, which we haven't really mentioned yet. But if you can see here on the left side of the screen,
I can't really see
you
it.
can't even see it. There's an extra place that we've set aside here at the table, and this is actually set aside for Elijah, the prophet Elijah, who's supposed to come before Jesus returns.
Mm-hmm.
The prophet Elijah is supposed to come in advance of Jesus returning again. And so we have this place that in case the second coming is to happen soon, and Elijah does come back, and he does show up at our house, we'll have a place for him to sit. So at this time in the meal, the youngest child will go to the door, and will open the door, and we'll see if Elijah's there. So if we could all do that, you better check, because if he's at your house and you don't check, that's kind of rude. So everybody go and see if Elijah's at the front door.
Our dog's going to check.
Our dog is going to check.
If he is at your house, we want to know. Yeah. Yeah. Mom said if he is at your house, make sure he washes his hands because of the quarantine.
All right,
Not
so
there.
he's not there.
Nope, he's not there.
So often what it will happen in a Jewish family is the child will say, "Not this year, Dad," and then they all say, "Next year in Jerusalem," which is interesting, right? Because they're anticipating this promise of a new Jerusalem. And we too are anticipating this promise of a new Jerusalem that will be the place where God will be with us and dwell among us again.
So that brings us to the last cup. And this is the cup of his praise, which is also in the Christian circles is labeled the cup of his coming. And this is kind of looking forward to that time when Jesus does come back. to Jerusalem again, and he brings restoration to the world. And so we celebrate this remembering him. So let me lead you in the prayer one more time. And if you've memorized it, you can say it with me. Okay? So let's try this. Say it all together. Maybe I'll say a phrase and you repeat it. Blessed are you,
Blessed are you,
O Lord our God,
O Lord our God,
King of the universe,
King of the universe,
and creator of the fruit of the vine.
And
Creator of the fruit of the vine.
And that brings us to the close of the meal. But there's something that the Jewish people do that we wanted you guys to be able to participate with us in. And they usually sing a song at the end. And so in your little booklet, if you've been following along with us, there's words to a song called Not to Us. Usually what they sing as a family are the Hallel Psalms, which are Psalms of Praise, specifically Psalms 113 to 118. And so this psalm that we're going to be singing, and let me just mention this too.
Jesus, too.
Yeah, Jesus, we read after the Passover, after he celebrates that with his disciples and designates his blood. It's right after that, it says they sang hymns. So in Matthew 26:30, it says, then they sang a hymn and went out onto the Mount of Olives.
Mm-hmm.
And it was on the Mount of Olives then that Jesus asked the disciples to stay awake with him, and they all fell asleep, and he prayed, and he sweat drops of blood, thinking about his death that was coming. But they did this too. They sang possibly the Hallel Psalms right at the end of the meal. And so we're going to sing this song by Sovereign Grace, and you have the words to it that's actually based on one of the Hallel Psalms, which is Psalm 115. And since I don't have my Bible, I can't read it again, but it says, verse 1 in Psalm 115 says, in this rough words, not to us, O Lord, but to your name be all the glory. For your faithfulness and steadfast love receive the glory. The glory belongs to you. So we're going to read or sing this song together with my family. And if you want to sing along with us, go ahead. Oh, do you have my Bible?
Can I join you?
Yeah, can I actually read it so that I'm not misquoting anything?
Make sure they know I have permission.
Okay, let me actually read it. Psalm 115. It's a little bit shorter than my version. It says, not to us, Lord, not to us, but to your name be the glory, because of your love and faithfulness.
Just so you know, sorry, I just thought this was kind of interesting. Rebecca and Nathan Pierpont both say that Elijah's at their house. So
Elijah's in 2 places.
Whoa.
That's impressive. Here's how it goes.
Not to us, but to your name alone be all the glory forever. For your faithfulness and steadfast love receive the glory belongs to you.
And I'll take verse 1.
All that we've accomplished you have done for us, and any fruit we harvest is a gift from your hand. We are only jars of clay that hold a priceless treasure, and we exist to bring you pleasure, oh God.
Not to us.
Not to us, but to your name alone be all the glory forever. For your faithfulness and steadfast love receive the glory belongs to you.
Verse 2. mercy can we come to you. But we deserve your judgment. You have called us by name. So we glory in the cross of Christ and made us yours forever. That join us together to sing. Not to us, but to your name alone be all the glory forever. For your faithfulness and steadfast love, receive the glory. The glory belongs to you. Amen. Well, why don't I close this in prayer, and then you can stay on if we want to continue talking, if you have more questions about the Passover.
Sure.
My dad, I think, would love to answer. I'm going to pray quickly. I also have a funny video that we might be able to show you that's a group of Jewish people singing about the Passover to the Lion King theme songs,
Oh no.
which is beautifully done. So we'll have to do that too. But let me pray. Lord, tonight is a night that we look to you. We look to what you did for us on the cross. We celebrate your coming the first time, and we also look forward to your coming again. And Lord, we thank you that all of these families were able to get together and to just think on together what you've done for us, to share in the cup that you have said is your blood, that is a representation of your blood. Lord, to share in the bread, which is a representation of your body. We're thankful for these symbols you've given us. Lord, we realize that they're just symbols, just a remembrance, and that it's not anything like magical happening. But at the same time, it's kind of magical to think about just how you have done so much for us and given us this special meal to celebrate that. And we look forward to the day when you come back and we can finally see you face to face, and we can finally thank you for what you've done, and we can, in a way of seeing you and seeing maybe the joy that's in your eyes as you look at us and say, I purchase you. That's going to be a day, and I thank you for that. I pray that as we just continue to talk right now, that it would just be honoring to you in everything. Lord, you are the King we serve, and we give this night to you. And we thank you in your name, Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you all for hanging in this whole time with us. And you are welcome. I can't super read it. I see it says thank you, but you're welcome to those of you who said thank you. Do we have any more questions? Anybody else have burning questions?
Or thoughts?
Or thoughts? Yeah. Comments?
I have a bit of a random one that came about halfway through the process, but so if Elijah doesn't show up, what was the tradition what do you do with the food that you set out for him?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question was, if Elijah doesn't show up, so the Pierponts and the Cornishes are exempt from this question because he did show up. If Elijah doesn't show up, then what do you do? What do you do with the extra food that is left on his plate? And is there some kind of tradition as far as what is done with the food? So I don't know.
So, well, the only tradition that I've typically heard is that it's a rehearsal of the fact of their anticipation of the coming kingdom, of this new Jerusalem. And so what often is said is next year in Jerusalem. But I can tell you what is a tradition in our family, and that is that Dad usually eats Elijah's food. That's exactly what we've done every year.
Reprehensible.
Yes. Chef's privilege.
I hear another question.
Yeah.
Or statement.
So another question behind that is that when they are talking about for Elisha, whatnot, isn't that going to be related to Elisha and Enoch, where they were both taken off from this world and they'll be coming back as two witnesses?
That is a theory.
Completely different?
We do read about that, don't we, in the book of the Revelation, that these
Right.
two witnesses are there as precursors to the second coming of Christ. And we know that even though in the Old Testament, even Jesus himself talks about how Elijah, the spirit of Elijah was on John the Baptist and was his forerunner in his first coming, and that Elijah will also be there to inaugurate this second coming. So yeah, that is a theory that many Christians hold to, is that Elijah is this spirit that even is at Malachi that talks about drawing the hearts of the fathers and the children again to one another in anticipation of a coming king, of a coming Messiah.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a great observation.
Right. So the theory being that since Elijah didn't die,
Hmm.
Elijah and Enoch are the two that we know of who. Is it just
We're
them?
translated.
Yeah, who they didn't ever die. God just took them straight to heaven.
Though we read about Moses and Elijah, right? Or
Yeah, Moses and Elijah coming back. So, but the theory being that those are the two witnesses in Revelation. So I don't know. That's a good. I think Dad's thoughts were probably very true, but it is a theory. I don't know that we know for sure. Good question.
From the Cornish family?
Yeah.
We have a Cornish from. So we started with the original Israelites leaving Egypt after eating a full meal. And then they come to the Seder meal that they observe every Passover, which is lots of smaller symbols of things. And then we take that and reduce it to the Lord's Supper, where we get one little tiny piece of cracker.
I know.
When we get to the Lord's Supper of the Lamb, is it going to get smaller? Or
So Tim's question was we've come from this full meal that was celebrated by the Jewish people, where they had to eat the whole lamb, and then like every piece of it, like you gotta get it down, and then we kind of limit it down to kind of like a more traditional meal, and then nowadays it's these symbols, and then the church kind of has limited it down even more to a single cracker and a little piece, a little sip of grape juice. So when Jesus comes again, is the marriage supper of the Lamb going to be even smaller, even less food? And I don't think so. My theory is it's probably going to be pretty extensive. But that is funny.
Question 2.
We're not on a good trend at this point. Yeah.
I have a question related to that. Okay, especially when we are all finally seated at the marriage supper of the Lamb, it's like, is it going to be so extensive that we're going to be able to see each other with all the food and everything? Where finally it's like, with those who are there and those who are not, isn't it going to be like really, really huge, like where we can't even fathom that?
So Daniel's follow-up question was, is the marriage supper of the Lamb going to be something so huge and lavish that we can't even imagine it? And I think, I can't say because I'm not there, but I have a feeling probably, seeing as it's like the ultimate celebration of all history. It's kind of like the peak climax thing. I don't think God doesn't usually skip out on blessing. It's usually over, like is it a proverb over in, it's not a proverb. That he
does exceedingly abundantly above all we think.
Well, not that. That's another one. But like that he blesses us, and it's like grain that fills the cup and spills over the cup.
Mm-hmm.
Or no, not grain. Oil. Sorry. Yeah. Oil. A full measure of oil spilling over. Right. Right. Yeah, so.
That's awesome. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. I don't know if we still have Facebook people, but you guys could ask questions too if you want to.
Another question from what I had asked previously, which was kind of sort of related to this stuff, but for how God gives for dreams and visions and whatnot. I don't know how it's going to be related to the whole entire Passover and everything, but to back recalling from my past and everything, while I was actually doing everything, God given me something where now, as I'm seeing it all around me, and I'm not sure how to really even put it together and everything, but I kind of sat and meditated on it and saying that, okay, now this is making sense where God, you put all this together, and how in the dream what was given unto me, where it's like I felt that I was like injecting myself, or that I was like getting all these viruses around me, where it was like one virus after another, and now as I see it, it's in resemblance where there's so many people themselves catching this virus that's all around, and in this day and age. So, can you see from your own end, Josiah, that that could have been definitely from God Himself?
I mean, there's always a possibility that God can speak to us through. The question was, could God have spoke to some of us through like a dream? Again, kind of back on that idea. And I think we again, like Dad said, we don't want to limit God by saying He never does that. You know, that's a pretty extreme thing to say. Then again, I don't think it's a normal thing to see a lot of dreams that are predictive of the future. I think most of the times that I've seen that kind of stuff, it's been kind of shady, like people kind of making things up. But I'm not gonna say that God couldn't speak to you that way. I'm not gonna say that that's beyond God's ability. I think the ultimate thing we need to do, if I have my Bible here, the ultimate thing we need to do is check everything against this. And if there's ever something that we think is God speaking to us and it doesn't line up with the Bible, then we have to realize that that's not true. So this is the ultimate test. Right, yeah, take it back to Scripture. But I've had some weird dreams too, man. Just crazy times. Do we have any others? I see the Brinks there. I didn't realize you were there, Brinks. But I can see your face. I guess they can't
Are they still
hear.
there? Or
They
did
might.
leave?
They might not hear. Who's the really tall person?
The Froms.
Oh, that's the Froms. Yes. Hey, Alan. So, good to see you guys.
Yeah, it was really good to see you.
Did you get your Bible stained with grape juice?
I did.
My Bible, my pants, the table,
The floor.
the floor.
We tried to clean it off fast, but
Yeah, you did a pretty good job.
if my mom were on the call, she would have told.
My job.
Yes. If my mom were on the call, she would have informed all of you that my nickname growing up was Slobby Robbie. So.
That's what we call the anointing.
Yes, I smell like grape juice. So I need to go shower.
Well, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, it was really good to see all of you. I'm going to stop the Facebook one because I think most of the people on Facebook have already gotten off. Goodbye if you are still on. Thank you for joining. It was really fun. So I'm going to turn off the...
Bye, Cornices.
See you guys.
Bye, Hayden.
Yep, feel free to Skype us in the next couple minutes if you still want to talk.
We appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for the Hayden family. Thank you so much. Be
Bye.
in touch with you, Josiah.
Yeah, God bless.
You too. Bye-bye.
See you, Daniel.
And goodbye, everybody here. I don't know how to turn it off. I think there's a button somewhere.
Somewhere.
Yeah, somewhere.
Emphasis on somewhere.
Oh, here we go.
Donde está?
You could just become a
It looks like there are 10 people on right now watching. So goodbye to those of you who are still on.